Now to East Africa for a look at Kenya and the remarkable man who leads it. President Jomo Kenyatta acknowledges the respectful cheers of a large crowd of Kenyans as he arrives for the celebrations of Madaraka Day earlier this year. The occasion is an annual event commemorating the day when Kenya gained self-government under British colonial rule. On that day 9 years ago, Jomo Kenyatta became Kenya's first Prime Minister and a few months later led 10 million Kenyans to full independence. It would be hard to overestimate Kenyatta's prestige among his own countrymen. He's a national father figure. To virtually every African, he's known respectfully as Mzee, the old one. Old he certainly is, but at 82, his faculties, both mental and physical, remain unimpaired. And every politician in the country knows that for as long as Kenyatta wishes to retain power, he will always be the boss. Kenyatta's greatest asset since he came to power has proved to be his ability to appeal across tribal barriers to all Africans, and so by sheer force of personality hold together a country which many thought would disintegrate through tribal conflicts once independence had been achieved. In Kenya today, as in many other African countries that have adopted the political forms of a European nation-state, tribalism is always a potential threat to national unity. Occasions like Madaraka Day are something of a safety valve. They allow each tribe to indulge its own special sense of identity through its own songs and dances. These dancers belong to the Luo tribe, the second largest in Kenya. The basis of tribal unrest in Kenya has always been the rivalry between the Luo and these people, the Kikuyu, Kenya's largest tribe, numbering well over 2 million. Kenyatta himself is a Kikuyu, and under his patronage, Kikuyus have come to dominate the country's political life. It was among the politically conscious Kikuyu that Kenyatta first came to prominence over 20 years ago during the savage tribal uprising known as Mau Mau. Kenyatta was sentenced to 7 years' imprisonment by a British court for allegedly organizing the Mau Mau movement, in which many European settlers were brutally massacred by Kikuyu fanatics. Though he was certainly regarded by many Kikuyus as their leader, Kenyatta always denied any complicity in Mau Mau itself. He was finally released in 1961, and although over 70 years old, he organized his own political party, KANU, the Kenya African National Union, and led it to victory at the country's first general elections in 1963. By the time the British left Kenya at the end of that year, Kenyatta was Prime Minister and already revered as the founder of the nation. As leader of the newly independent nation, one of Kenyatta's first acts was to appeal to those Mau Mau fighters who were still in the bush and who'd been too frightened to surrender while the British still ruled. Kenyatta assured them he understood their grievances and would put them right. Most of those grievances concerned land. Under colonial rule, much of the best land in Kenya had been reserved exclusively for English settlers who farmed large tracts and built themselves spacious houses. Over the years, these settlers developed a kind of home from home, a little England complete with green lawns and lush gardens. In these so-called White Highlands, no African was allowed to own any land. He could only work as a labourer for a European boss. This discrimination was the basic reason behind the Mau Mau troubles. Militant Kikuyus resented what they saw as their disinheritance from traditional tribal lands. In the last few years before independence, the colonial government began to admit Africans to these European areas, and when Kenyatta came to power, he sought to speed up the process. Europeans who wanted to leave were bought out, and their large estates were then split up into small plots and redistributed among formerly landless Africans, many of whom were Kikuyus. But the Africanizing of agriculture stopped well short of driving the Europeans out. Independent Kenya could ill afford to lose all the farming skills of the settlers. Of the 3,000 white farmers in Kenya in 1960, several hundred are still there today. Their presence is a measure of the confidence that Kenyatta has been able to generate and sustain. Confidence also seems to be the keynote of Nairobi, Kenya's capital. Modern, multi-story office blocks make up the skyline of one of the best-planned cities in Africa. In the streets, over 500,000 people compete with 40,000 cars. Nairobi's growth owes a lot to the political stability that Kenya has shown since independence. Much of the city's development has been carried out with foreign capital, which is being attracted in increasingly large amounts. In 1964, £2 million were invested in Nairobi's building industry. Last year, the figure was £16 million. But behind the smooth facades of the skyscrapers, there's another Nairobi of squalid shanties and abject poverty. Nearly a quarter of the city's population lives in conditions like these. Many of the people who live here have come from country areas, hoping to exchange a rural subsistence life for the material comforts of a job in the capital where wages are 3 times as high. The great majority don't succeed. They simply join the queues of unemployed. 20% of the city's population is out of work. Nairobi's population increases by nearly 40,000 a year, and by the end of the century, 1 million people could be looking for jobs in and around the capital. On current estimates, fewer than 2/3 will be able to find them. Unemployment isn't confined to Nairobi. It's a national problem, and on occasions in the past, the government's tried to improve the situation by simply decreeing that all employers, including itself, should increase their labour forces by 10%. The long-term answer to Kenya's problem is to push through development projects and job training schemes in the rural areas, where over 90% of the population live, and so stop the drift into the towns. That's easier said than done. It's happening, but very slowly. Africanization in commerce is also proceeding in an orderly fashion now after the scare of 4 years ago when thousands of Asians from Kenya fled to Britain in a panic rush. Asians who are Kenyan citizens are allowed to continue their businesses. The brightest part of Kenya's economy is the tourist industry, whose receipts increased 30% last year. The tourist minibuses roll out of Nairobi in their hundreds for the 10-minute drive to the game park. Last year, 400,000 visitors came to see the wildlife. The tourist influx is largely responsible for Nairobi's European image of big hotels and luxury shops. The city already has its Hilton and Intercontinental, and 3 more large hotels are under construction. In his foreign relations, Kenyatta has laid most emphasis on Kenya's role in East Africa. Relations with his neighbor, President Nyerere of Tanzania, have always been good, despite the strikingly different personalities of the two men. With Nyerere and the former president of Uganda, Milton Obote, Kenyatta established the East African Community 5 years ago. Today, it's Africa's largest and most successful economic grouping. In domestic politics, Kenyatta has remained undisputed master in his own house. For nearly 10 years, he's been calling the tune, and the rest of Kenya's politicians have been marching to it.
Watu nataka watulizane ndio tuweze kufanya hiyo sherehe ya mchango wa pesa. Sasa basi tayari. Harambee!
Kenyatta's watchword, Harambee. It's inscribed on Kenya's official coat of arms. It means pulling together, and Kenyatta employs it as a popular slogan against tribal, racial, and even political divisions. But there have been times during Kenyatta's rule when Harambee's been forgotten. This man, Oginga Odinga, was the first vice president of Kenya and a leading light in Kenyatta's party. He's a Luo and a communist. In 1966, he resigned from the government and formed his own party in opposition to Kenyatta. 3 years later, just before general elections were due, his party was banned and several supporters imprisoned, a fate that eventually befell Odinga himself in 1970. After 18 months in detention, he was released last year and has now rejoined KANU.
In many cases are diametrically opposite.
Tom Mboya was another prominent Luo in Kenyatta's cabinet. A brilliant Minister of Economic Development and party secretary, Mboya was tipped as a successor to Kenyatta, despite being from a minority tribe. His presence in the government did much to maintain tribal harmony. As long as he was there, most Luos felt they could trust the government. But in 1969, Mboya was shot dead by a Kikuyu gunman, and in the days that followed, Kenya seemed to be tottering towards the brink of tribal conflict that so many had forecast before independence. At Mboya's funeral, the grief of many Luos turned to anger, and a riot developed outside the cathedral. It was about the only occasion in Kenyatta's career when he seemed in any personal danger from the public. After Mboya's death and the banning of Odinga's opposition party, KANU's claim to be a party of all tribes seemed to be wearing thin. In the parliamentary elections in December 1969, voters had no choice of party. Only KANU candidates appeared on the lists. Kenya had in fact become a de facto one-party state. By allowing the elections to go forward as planned, Kenyatta ran the risk that disaffected Luos would boycott the polls and that the new assembly would therefore reflect overwhelmingly Kikuyu interests, a move that would have emphasized tribal divisions. This didn't happen, but popular Luo resentment was expressed through the defeat of many old guard politicians and the election of younger members. Is this the man to succeed President Kenyatta? Daniel Arap Moi, Kenya's Vice President and Home Affairs Minister. The Constitution provides that in the event of the President's death, the Vice President should take over with limited powers for a period of 90 days, after which popular elections have to be held for a new president. Whether Moi would emerge successful from the power struggle that would follow President Kenyatta's passing is anyone's guess. He's not a Kikuyu and actually began his career in opposition to KANU, but he could be a compromise candidate. Over the last decade, Kenya's confounded all those who made gloomy predictions at the time of independence. Compared with many other African countries, Kenya's achieved at least an outward stability. There have been problems, it's true, but none that have had to be resolved by violence. At 82, President Kenyatta's popularity shows no sign of waning. If he's criticized for anything at all, it's that he's no longer completely in tune with the younger generation. In one sense, President Kenyatta has been too successful. The sense of unity and national purpose which he's forged are still embodied in his own person, and that poses serious problems for Kenya's future, for despite his prolonged vigor, he cannot stay at the helm indefinitely. His departure will leave a gap that his successors, whoever they are, will find difficult, if not impossible, to fill.